All right, so I have my little setup going on right now. This is what I often use when I'm actually trying to analyze stuff. I got Flopzilla over here, Poker Stove over here to see the absolute amount of equity for both ranges, then a little notepad in case you need to write anything down for later. So right here is the cutoff open range. It's a pretty standard cutoff open. It's 26%. If yours is a little different, it doesn't really matter much. But the one thing I really want you to pay attention to now, because it's going to be a big deal, is look at what the offsuit combos are. We have 16 combos of Queen 10. That's a big deal. So if a board hits Queen 10 and we have those offsuit combos, it might be pretty significant. That's true for the cutoff open, but it's especially true for the cutoff versus button flat. Because here the range is smaller, it's only 13.5%. So a hand like King Queen makes up a really big chunk of this range. So that's something we're going to notice as we go through this video. The other thing you probably want to take note of is these aces and ace kings are weighted at, I believe, 25%. It's good to sort of have some hands that can flop well on king high board textures, so I have them in the button flatting range. They're also good for in case you get squeezed. So anyways, just note they're in the range and then pay a special attention to the offsuit combos. They're a pretty big deal when they hit. Alright, so let's randomly generate our first flop. Alright, so Queen 9-7 Rainbow. So there's no real right way to go about analyzing a board texture when you're doing it, but the way I usually like to start, and you're going to see me often do this, is how easy is it to defend checks by check calling when you're out of position? Because if it's a board that's pretty easy to defend by check calling, then it's going to have a pretty big impact on how often your opponent bets the flop, how often you check, how big your opponent's bet sizing is, and all that kind of stuff. So that's a really, really important question to ask, because if you're very aggressively check raising on a board, then your opponent's going to bet differently than if you're, check calling very frequently. So that's the first question that I often ask, and that's an interesting question to ask here. Because this is a board texture where if you're out of position, you probably both don't hate or love giving free cards with a lot of hands. So let's look. So what kind of hands here would make sense to check call? And now really pause for a moment and ask yourself, what kind of hands are you check calling with here? Because if you're one of those players that once he checks, almost always check folds, and I played like that for a long time, you can still win a lot playing that way. It's just not the best way to play as you're trying to get better. But if you are one of those players that plays that way, you're probably going to notice here, you're just not check calling that much stuff. I can easily think of some players that say to themselves, well, I'm going to value bet all my queens because I can get called from weaker hands. I'm also going to bet jacks and tens because I don't want to really give a free card and I can still get value from worse. So I'm pretty much going to bet all that kind of stuff. Then I'm also going to bet sevens just as kind of like a semi-bluff. And then I'm going to bet all my draw. Like they just say that and then they end up betting pretty much every single hand and check fold the rest. Obviously, it's very, very easy for your opponent to exploit you if you're doing that. So think for a moment, what kind of hands would you like to check or call here? And if you can't think of any, like for example, if you're like, I don't really like check calling on this board, just it's not for me. If that's the case, then you probably should be check raising here more aggressively. Because if you're not going to defend, imagine you're playing against me. I'm on the button, you're in the cutoff. If you're not defending your checks by check calling, then that lets me bet this flop just a ton. And you know what punishes me for betting the flop a ton? You check raising. And that also avoids the problem you might be afraid of, which is I don't really want to check call and give a bunch of free cards. Check raising doesn't. Also keep in mind, when you check raise, usually the hands that your opponent could outdraw you with are going to semi-bluff on the flop. So, for example, you might be like, well, I don't want to check raise pocket sevens. My opponent could hit his gutter. He's going to bet his gutter on the flop. So, if you do have a problem check calling on this board, that's an indicator that you probably should be more check raising more aggressively than you are. Let's put a pin on that check calling idea for one moment and start off with thinking, how strong does a hand need to be to bet on this flop? Now, one thing that's important to remember is if you bet around 75% of the pot on all three streets, your opponent usually ends up needing to defend around 20 to 25% of his range. And that's mostly if your opponent's defending by calling down. So on a board texture like this, you don't want to make the mistake and go, okay, so let's see, if the opponent needs to defend about 20% of his range, whoa, the opponent's only going to felt, his top pair hands. So 25%, my opponent might felt all of his top pair and better hands if I bet all three streets. That's not really true, because that would be true if the opponent only called down, but since he's going to raise some of his value hands, he's also going to raise some bluffs. So rather than calling down with Queen 10, if you bet all three streets, your opponent might turn Queen 10 into a bluff if he's playing optimally, because he's going to need some hands to balance out his pocket 9s and pocket 7s, which are going to put in a value raise at some point. So on this flop texture, the opponent's probably raising maybe aces, but probably for sure raising 9s, 7s, and 9-7 suited, either on the flop or on a good turn card. So here, when you are thinking about value betting, it's probably really pushing it if you're trying to value bet a hand like Queen Jack for a big sizing, because your opponent's just never going to call down worse if he's playing well.